Chapter 1. The sun poured over the village green of much Dithering, casting its warm light on the bunting-strung stalls and polished silver teapots glinting under striped awnings. It was the annual summer fete, hosted as always by Lady Sybil Marchmont on the grounds of her ivy-covered manor. Children darted between sponge cake competitions and sack races. The local vicar, Reverend George Fallowby, cheerfully judged the jam entries, though he looked slightly pale after tasting Mrs. Plumstead's brandy surprise. And amid it all, like a modest centrepiece to the chaos, sat Miss Marple in a folding chair with a thin crochet blanket across her lap. She was not as frail as she looked, though she happily let others believe so. Her blue eyes, sharp beneath the brim of her sun hat, scanned the crowd with quiet precision. She noticed the way Sybil's cousin, Basil Marchmont, stood apart from the others near the rose arbour, his jaws set, arms folded. Sybil's voice, always sharp-edged, had taken on a falsely jovial tone as she introduced her niece Clara to the local solicitor. Clara, for her part, seemed eager to escape the conversation. It was all quite ordinary, and that was what troubled Miss Marple. "These garden parties," said Colonel Hayward, settling into the chair beside her with a soft grunt. "They all blend together in the end, don't they?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, her fingers tightening slightly around her teacup. "Each one has its own flavour." The Colonel chuckled. "Always watching, aren't you, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled. "People rarely notice what they reveal when they think no one is watching." Across the lawn, a sudden clatter drew attention. A porcelain plate had slipped from someone's hand. Basil Marchmont stood over the broken shards, frowning as he stooped to pick them up. But it wasn't the accident that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the way no one rushed to help. The air held an undertone, like the moment before a storm. From the bandstand, Mrs. Penelope Watts began a warbling rendition of Greensleeves, drawing polite applause. Miss Marple noted how Sybil's expression tightened ever so slightly with each off-key note. Sybil was a woman who demanded polish, in her events, her household, and certainly her relatives. By 3 o'clock, the judging of the floral arrangements was complete. The sherry had begun to flow, and gossip had found its natural rhythm. It was then that Lady Sybil's voice rang out, measured, authoritative. "Before we conclude this lovely afternoon," she announced, "I should like to say a few words." The crowd hushed. Sybil stepped onto the small wooden stage, her crimson dress rustling like a drawn curtain. "I do believe," she said, "that it is time for changes. I've made some decisions about Marchmont House and its future. Matters of inheritance are not to be taken lightly." There was a ripple through the crowd. A single glance passed between Basil and Clara, quick, anxious. Sybil went on, but Miss Marple no longer heard the words. She was watching hands, tightened grips, nervously adjusted hats, sidelong glances. She had seen similar patterns in St. Mary Mead during moments when money or titles were mentioned. Such things had a way of unearthing the buried and the bitter. When Sybil finished, there was applause, polite, thin. But Miss Marple did not clap. She looked to the sky instead. The first distant roll of thunder cracked in the distance. "A storm coming," said Colonel Hayward. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "in more ways than one." That evening, long after the garden party had ended, and Lady Sybil had returned to her drawing-room with her decanter of port, the village of Much Dithering began to quiet once more. But beneath the surface, the air still hummed with something unsaid. By morning, the peace would be shattered. Chapter 2. By dawn, the village awoke to rain-slicked cobblestones and low-hanging clouds that smothered the rooftops of Much Dithering like grey wool. Birds chirped in short, uncertain bursts before falling silent again. At Marchmont House, the shutters were still drawn, and the gravel drive sat undisturbed, save for the solitary bicycle of Dr. Lionel Pierce, its frame leaning against the gate like a crooked question mark. Inside, silence pressed heavily on the drawing-room. The maid, Nora, had entered with a tray of breakfast as usual, only to stop dead in the doorway. The tray clattered to the rug. Lady Sybil Marchmont sat in her favourite armchair beside the hearth, dressed in the same crimson from the day before, her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her eyes half-lidded. The port decanter beside her was uncorked, and her glass stood empty. Nora did not scream. Instead, she backed out of the room, her face gone chalk-white. The butler, Mr. Kellam, found her shaking in the hallway, hands gripping her apron like a lifeline. By 8 o'clock, word had already reached the High Street, and by past it reached Miss Marple. She was in the village grocer's, selecting a modest wheel of Wensleydale, when Mrs. Duncombe leaned in close, breath-scented with peppermint lozenges. "Gone, poor thing," she whispered, "in the drawing-room no less." Nora found her stiff as a board. "They say it was the port." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "How sad. Lady Sybil did enjoy her port, though I believe she was more fond of control than intoxication." Mrs. Duncombe blinked. "Beg pardon." "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said, paying for her cheese. "It's just, well, most people do tend to loosen their grip near the end. Sybil always struck me as the opposite sort." She left the shop with her basket, taking the long route home past the Marchmont gates. Outside the house, 2 constables stood stiffly under the portico. One of them recognized her and tipped his hat. Miss Marple merely offered a polite smile and kept walking, but her mind was turning. A death at Marchmont House, and so soon after a pointed announcement about inheritance. By midday, Inspector Cray had arrived from Guildingford, a tall man with a salt-and-pepper moustache and a gaze that rarely blinked. He interviewed the staff first, Nora, still shaken, Mr. Kellam, as precise as a metronome, and Cook, who kept dabbing her eyes, though she confessed she never liked the woman. In the drawing-room, the body had already been taken away, but Inspector Cray stood by the drinks table, frowning at the half-empty port decanter. No sign of struggle. Door locked. No forced entry. No odd bruises. No scratch marks. Nothing. Broken. Dr. Pierce stood beside him, arms folded. "I'm calling it heart failure. She had high blood pressure, complained of shortness of breath for weeks. It fits." Cray grunted. "Convenient, though, isn't it? Just after she publicly mentioned changing her will." Pierce raised a brow. "You think someone slipped something in her port?" "I think someone might have," Cray said, "but no evidence yet." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Clara Marchmont stood at her cottage doorstep, umbrella dripping, eyes rimmed with red. I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple," she said, voice low. "May I come in?" "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple led her to the sitting-room, offered her tea, and sat with her hands folded listening. "I suppose it's awful to say, but I'm not surprised," Clara whispered. "Aunt Sybil was difficult. She held everyone at arm's length, even me." "You seemed rather nervous yesterday," Miss Marple said gently, "when your aunt made her little speech." Clara hesitated, "Because I knew what was coming. She told me the night before that she intended to change her will. She said Basil wouldn't like it one bit, that she'd rather leave Marchmont House to a charity than to him. And you, my dear, were you to inherit anything?" Clara looked down. "Only a trust fund. I never expected more." Miss Marple watched her. The girl was grieving, yes, but something else lingered, like a bruise just beneath the surface. Guilt? Fear? Clara finished her tea in silence and departed, shortly after promising to call again. That evening Miss Marple sat by the fire, crocheting the hem of a baby blanket for the vicar's new niece, but her thoughts strayed to a teacup, a glass of port, and a woman who had made enemies of those closest to her. Dr. Pierce's diagnosis seemed plausible, but if it were natural, why did Miss Marple's instincts hum with unease? She considered Basil Marchmont, silent, glowering; Clara, frightened but oddly composed; and Sybil, poised as ever, even in death. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Inspector Cray. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "Thought I'd pay you the courtesy of a word. We've found nothing suspicious. Doctor says natural causes. Case might be closed." Miss Marple looked up over her spectacles. "Might be, yes, or perhaps not quite." He smiled faintly. "You think it was murder?" Miss Marple's fingers resumed their crochet. "I think Lady Sybil Marchmont never did anything without reason, including dying." Chapter 3. 3 days after Lady Sybil's death, Marchmont House opened its doors once more, this time under a softer, more solemn air. Heavy curtains remained drawn against the summer sun, and vases of lilies stood sentry on polished tables in a show of grief that smelled too strong and bloomed too soon. The wake, organized with brittle efficiency by Mr. Kellogg, was a modest affair, restricted to close friends, village dignitaries, and the extended Marchmont family. The air inside was not of mourning, but of restraint. Voices were hushed, movements stiff. In much dithering, grief and gossip had always been uncomfortable bedfellows. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 3, dressed in a muted grey ensemble with delicate black gloves. She nodded to the vicar, offered a gentle word to Clara, who looked thinner than she had 3 days ago, and took a seat near the fireplace, hands resting lightly on her handbag. She had no intention of lingering near the refreshments. It was conversation she had come for, and the kinds of silences that followed it. "Such a dreadful business," murmured Mrs. Chudley, a round woman in lavender taffeta. "So sudden, though not entirely unexpected, if you ask me." "No?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Well, dear Sybil hadn't been herself lately. She spoke rather darkly of betrayals and consequences. Told my husband she felt the family had begun circling her like crows." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Curious metaphor." "I thought so too. But you know Sybil, dramatic, but rarely mistaken in her instincts." Across the room, Basil Marchmont stood near the drinks cabinet, speaking in low tones with a thin-lipped, solicitor named Mr. Hartridge. Basil's stance was rigid, his tone clipped. Occasionally he cast a glance toward Clara, who sat apart with her eyes fixed on the rug. Miss Marple quietly rose and approached the serving table, where Mr. Kellam stood with military poise beside a pot of coffee. "Such a fine gathering, Mr. Kellam," she said. "Lady Sybil would have approved." He bowed slightly. "Her ladyship valued propriety, Miss Marple, even in death." "Tell me," she said softly, "did she take her port alone that evening?" Kellam hesitated only briefly. "Yes, ma'am. She dismissed the staff early. Said she wanted time to herself." "Unusual." He met her gaze, unblinking. "Very." "Did she often entertain visitors late?" "No, ma'am." Miss Marple turned the cup in her hand thoughtfully. "And the decanter, was it left out overnight?" "Yes. I found it just as the maid did." "Unusual again." "Quite." Miss Marple returned to her chair, but remained standing a moment longer, observing the room. It was not Clara or Basil who caught her attention, nor the solicitor, nor the gossiping villagers. It was a woman she hadn't seen at the garden party. Tall, thin, with a pale scarf knotted tightly around her throat, the woman stood near the stairwell, saying little and watching everyone. Miss Marple crossed over. "Forgive me," she said gently. "I don't believe we've met." The woman offered a faint smile. "Elspeth Denholm. I was Sybil's companion once, long ago. We travelled together when she was younger. Egypt, Morocco, places she never spoke of here." Miss Marple nodded. "She rarely spoke of anything beyond the village, I believe, and yet she chose to reach quite far in her last days." Elspeth's eyes flicked sideways. "She wrote me, just before the fete, asked me to come, said she feared something was going to happen." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Did she mention what?" "She only said—" Elspeth paused as though weighing the words. "That someone would find her end before she chose it herself." "Before she chose it?" Miss Marple frowned slightly. That phrase was not one Sybil Marchmont would use lightly. She turned to her seat, thoughts knitting themselves into an uncomfortable shape. Moments later, Inspector Cray entered. He nodded at a few familiar faces and took up a position beside the fireplace. The hush thickened. "I'll keep this brief," he began. "Though Dr. Pierce has ruled the cause of death as natural, the circumstances remain noteworthy. Lady Sybil had recently informed several people of her plans to amend her will. As a matter of procedure, we're reviewing the estate's legal documents and financial holdings." "Is there an official inquiry, Inspector?" Mr. Hartridge asked, adjusting his spectacles. "Not yet," Cray replied evenly, "but certain inconsistencies deserve closer attention." Clara stirred. "Inconsistencies?" Cray looked at her. "Miss Marchmont, your aunt's new will was never submitted to her solicitor. The old will, dated 3 years ago, remains in effect. You inherit the trust. Mr. Basil Marchmont receives the house and estate." Basil said nothing. The room buzzed faintly. Miss Marple watched Clara's face, not for grief, but for something quieter. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. After the wake, as guests trickled out into the drizzling evening, Miss Marple found herself beside Elspeth Denholm once more. "Would you be staying long in the village?" she asked casually. Elspeth nodded. "A few more days. I feel I ought to." Indeed, sometimes the dead leave behind rather persistent questions. Elspeth didn't smile this time. She merely looked past Miss Marple toward Marchmont House, eyes narrowing. "She knew it was coming," Elspeth said, quietly. "That's why she invited me back. Not to see her off, but to see who was left behind." Chapter 4. The morning after the wake, the Marchmont solicitor, Mr. Hartridge, summoned the inheritors to his office on Church Street, a narrow brick building sandwiched between the post office and the milliner's shop, with windows that hadn't been cleaned since the last general election. Miss Marple, of course, had no reason to attend. And yet, at 10:30, she found herself browsing hats next door with deliberate leisure, her ear tilted subtly towards the solicitor's wall. Inside, Hartridge cleared his throat and unfolded a sheaf of cream-coloured papers before Clara, Basil, and Elspeth Denholm, who had been invited at Basil's insistence, though no one quite knew why. "The will in force," Hartridge began, "dated March of 1952, divides Lady Marchmont's estate as follows. The sum of £10,000 to Miss Clara Marchmont, held in trust until her 30th birthday. The remainder, Marchmont House, lands and holdings, pass to Mr. Basil Marchmont." Clara's fingers tensed in her lap. Basil said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward her for a fraction too long. There had been, Hartridge added, mention of a new draft. However, no revised document has been submitted or located. Therefore, the original will stands. "May I ask," Clara said quietly, "what became of the draft? Did Aunt Sybil mention it to you?" "No, though I was made aware she had been composing letters, personal ones. Perhaps she kept the draft with them. But her writing desk has been thoroughly searched. Nothing remains." Miss Marple, listening through the thin partition between the shops, made a mental note. No new will, yet multiple individuals had known she intended one. And yet, nothing, no trace. For a woman as meticulous as Sybil, that was unnatural looks. At her cottage, Miss Marple arranged her findings into rows in her mind, like specimens beneath glass. A woman feared, not loved, a promise of change, now silenced, a death neatly framed as natural, and a will, once spoken of openly, now vanished as though it never existed. That afternoon, Inspector Cray paid her another visit. This time, he came unannounced and without pretext, which Miss Marple took as a compliment. "She certainly made life difficult," he said, accepting the cup of tea she handed him, "even from the grave." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "Sybil Marchmont often made her intentions clear, even when she chose not to act on them. Tell me, Inspector, was her study searched?" "Top to bottom, nothing out of place." "And the typewriter?" He frowned. "Still there. Standard Remington. Ribbon recently changed, but that's all." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I wonder, then, why a woman so deliberate would leave no written trace of her new intentions. Unless she expected someone to destroy them." Cray leaned forward. "You think the will was destroyed?" "I think," Miss Marple said delicately, "that whoever stood to lose the most had the most reason to ensure it never surfaced." That evening, Clara returned to Marchmont House alone. The servants had been dismissed for the night, and the halls echoed with too much space. She moved through them slowly, as though expecting to hear her aunt's clipped voice around every corner. In the drawing-room, A stack of condolence letters awaited her, neatly arranged by Mr. Kellam. Clara picked one at random and opened it, absently, her eyes scanning the page without seeing it. Then her fingers froze. One envelope, not addressed in the same neat hand, bore no stamp, no seal. Inside, a single sheet of parchment. On it, in Lady Sybil's unmistakable hand, "If I am gone, it was no accident. The house must not go to Basil." Clara's breath caught. She turned the letter over. No signature, no date, just the single sentence, blunt, urgent, unmistakable. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Clara whirled. "Who's there?" No reply, just the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the entryway. She folded the note quickly and slipped it into her coat pocket. The next morning, Clara arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just after sunrise. Her coat still damp with dew. "I found this," she said, handing over the letter. Miss Marple read it silently, her brow knitting. "No stamp, no date," Clara whispered. "But it's her handwriting. I know it is." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but curious, isn't it? A letter she never sent, hidden among condolences, almost as though she wanted someone to find it, but not too soon. You think she feared someone would go through her things?" "I think," Miss Marple said, folding the page, "Lady Sybil knew her enemy far better than anyone else did." Clara hesitated at the door. "Do you think it was Basil?" "Do you think it was Basil?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she said, "Have you ever noticed, my dear, that when people stand to inherit a great deal, they become quite expert at waiting?" Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "Only that impatience often leaves fingerprints, especially on the things one wishes to make disappear." Chapter 5. Rain returned the next morning, steady and unrelenting, tapping against the window panes of cottages and shop fronts, as though trying to whisper something urgent. Miss Marple sat by her kitchen table, the letter from Clara spread before her like a half-buried seed, waiting to grow into something darker. "If I am gone, it was no accident." 8 words, measured, chilling. She held the letter up to the light. The parchment was high quality, the ink slightly faded, and though it bore no watermark or date, the script, Sybil's crisp, slanted hand, left little doubt of its origin. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and looked again at the envelope. No seal, no address, no fold creases, which suggested it had never been posted or even prepared for delivery. It was simply a message meant to be found after, and only if Sybil failed to protect herself. By mid-morning, she made her way through the village to the home of Dr. Lionel Pierce. It was not a social visit. He greeted her with his usual brisk politeness, though his eyes darted to the clock on the mantelpiece, a subtle cue that he had appointments pending. "Forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple said, settling primly into the armchair opposite his desk. "But I've been thinking about Lady Sybil's health." "Of course," he replied, pouring himself a small glass of water. "As you know, she had chronic hypertension, nothing unusual for her age." "But she was careful," Miss Marple said mildly. "Rarely indulged, didn't smoke, walked regularly. You once mentioned she was obsessive about her blood pressure." Pierce nodded. "She was, quite irritatingly so." "And yet she took port before bed," Miss Marple added, watching him closely. "You said so yourself." that it was not uncommon, shifted. Yes, in moderation. Miss Marple placed the letter gently on the table between them. And what if I told you she suspected someone intended harm? Would that change your diagnosis? The doctor hesitated, the air in the room tightening like a drawn curtain. That handwriting, he said after a moment. It's hers? Miss Marple gave a single deliberate nod. Found tucked among sympathy letters. Not mailed, not destroyed. Pierce rubbed his jaw. Then we may need to reconsider some assumptions. I signed the certificate in good faith. There were no signs of trauma, no clear indication of poison. Her glass bore no residue, and she had no recent complaints. But if she feared for her life, then perhaps she was meant to die without a trace. Pierce's frown deepened. I'll reach out to the coroner's office. Quietly. If there's anything irregular in her blood work, we may have overlooked it. As Miss Marple left the house, her thoughts turned not to the contents of the letter, but to its placement. Who sorted the sympathy notes? Who touched them before Clara? The maid, the butler, or perhaps someone who wanted it hidden in plain sight, where it might be missed or conveniently dismissed. Back in the village, Clara sat alone in the reading room of the Marchmont Library. She had taken to sleeping in one of the guest rooms, unable to bring herself to rest in the master suite. She sifted through her aunt's old notebooks, calendars, and marginalia, searching for something, anything that might explain the vanished will or the letter's context. And then she found it. A torn corner of stationery wedged beneath a stack of gardening catalogues. At first, it seemed inconsequential, but the date at the top, July 14th, was only 2 days before Sybil's death, and in the margin a scribbled phrase, will rewritten, must place with Elspeth, safe until finalized. Clara's breath hitched. Elspeth Denham. She rose at once and walked straight to the village inn where Elspeth had taken a room. It was raining harder now, and by the time she arrived her coat was soaked through. Elspeth opened the door slowly, a silk robe belted tightly at her waist. "I'm sorry to intrude," Clara said breathlessly. "But did my aunt give you something? Papers? Anything?" Elspeth's expression barely changed. "No." "You're sure? She wrote here," Clara showed the torn note, "that she intended to leave a draft with you, to be kept safe." Elspeth studied the scrap, then lifted her eyes slowly. "She never gave me a will. And if she had, Clara, do you think I'd have destroyed it?" "I don't know what to think," Clara whispered. "She was frightened," Elspeth said quietly. "I saw it in her face. She wasn't someone who ever admitted fear, but she did then. She told me to stay close in case something happened, but she never said why." There was a pause, then Elspeth added, "You're not the only one who's been asking after her things." Clara blinked. "Who else?" "Basil." Clara's mouth fell open. Elspeth's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He came the morning after she died. Said he needed to collect personal effects. Insisted on going through her desk himself. Told Kellum to leave him be." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple received a brief telephone call from Inspector Cray. "We've ordered a discreet post-mortem. Results in 48 hours, but no signs of toxins so far." Miss Marple looked out the window, rain pooling in the garden path, no signs, no trace, and yet Sybil left warnings. Cray was silent on the other end. "She feared Basil," Miss Marple said. And yet she didn't accuse him, just left breadcrumbs, a letter, a note to Clara, a mention to Elspeth. Why so careful, Inspector? Because, Cray replied slowly, if she named him directly, and nothing happened to her, she'd be inviting war. Miss Marple hung up the phone and returned to her armchair. The will was missing, the warning unsent. The wrong person inherited everything. But someone had touched those pages, and someone else had very nearly missed them. Chapter 6. The sun returned the next morning, casting the village in sharp relief. Every hedge a little too green, every chimney puffing with quiet regularity, but the calm was superficial. At Marchmont House the air had changed. Clara could feel it pressing against the windows, silent and heavy. She had not told Basil about the letter, nor the torn note about Elspeth. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because she already knew how he'd react. Cool dismissal, a barbed remark, a sudden urgency to move on. Instead, Clara focused her efforts where she thought they might matter. Miss Marple. "Do you think he destroyed the will?" Clara asked her plainly that morning, as they walked the gravel path behind St. Michael's Church. A flock of crows scattered from the yew trees above, their calls slicing through the quiet. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. "I think," she said at last, "that if Basil truly believed he'd lost his inheritance, he wouldn't have waited a moment to act. But Lady Sybil was clever. She said very little and implied quite a lot. She may have set more than one trap." Clara glanced at her. "You think there's another clue?" "I think there's something yet unseen. She trusted you, Elspeth, and perhaps even me, though I flatter myself. But who she didn't trust may be the key." Back at Marchmont House, Basil was giving orders. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drum, had returned after a brief absence, and was overseeing the reorganization of Sybil's belongings. Boxes lined the hallway, some sealed, others half filled with letters, ledgers, and photographs. "Dispose of anything that looks irrelevant," Basil instructed. "If it's personal or ancient, it goes to the attic. And I want the library cleared by Friday." Miss Marple, paying a quiet visit under the pretence of borrowing a book Sybil had once promised her, arrived just in time to observe this little scene. Basil greeted her with mechanical politeness, gesturing vaguely toward the corridor. "You'll find the library rather bare, I'm afraid," he said. "Clearing things out. Quite a process." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "The process of forgetting always is." Basil's smile froze. "I beg your pardon?" But Miss Marple had already moved past him. Inside the library, the fire was unlit, and a musty scent clung to the carpet, unusual for a room Sybil once kept fastidiously clean. A small stack of books remained on the window-sill. Among them, a gardening almanac with a folded page. Miss Marple opened it delicately. An annotation in the margin caught her eye. "He's too quick to assume. Delay is my only defense." Her fingers paused. Not a name, no context, but it carried the same tone as the earlier note, deliberate, aware, cautious. Sybil had known she was walking a tightrope. She closed the book just as Clara entered. "I've been through her drawers again," Clara whispered. "Nothing more, not a trace of the draft, but I did find something odd." She reached into her coat and held out a small slip of paper, creased and slightly stained. It looked unremarkable, but the name printed in block type near the top caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Hawthorne's Chemist, Guildingford Branch, a receipt, dated 2 days before Sybil's death. The item, Atrapa belladonna, restricted, dispensed under medical license. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She purchased belladonna, she said slowly. That's very serious. It's only prescribed in minute doses, for pain, or occasionally as a sedative. She didn't mention it, Clara said. I only found the slip beneath the stair carpet, loose edge in the corner. Miss Marple's thoughts turned quickly. Sybil had obtained a dangerous substance legally, quietly, likely for personal use. But had she used it on herself, or had it been used against her? Do you still have the port bottle? She asked suddenly. Clara blinked. Yes, it's in the pantry. Seal it, hide it, and do not mention this to Basil. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray in his small office above the village constable station. The belladonna receipt lay on the desk between them. We missed it, he muttered, rubbing his temple. It wasn't logged. Dr. Pierce didn't prescribe it. He confirmed that himself. Then she must have used an old prescription, Miss Marple said, or more likely, convinced the chemist using her name and standing. Which makes this either a suicide, Cray said, or an extremely clever murder. Miss Marple's reply was soft, or both. Cray looked up. She knew someone wanted her gone, Miss Marple continued. She knew her time was short. Perhaps she took the belladonna to numb herself, or perhaps to bait a trap. Cray's eyes narrowed. A trap. Consider, if she was being watched, if someone meant to finish her quietly, and she made sure something deadly was left in plain view, you think she wanted the killer to reach for it? Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. Sometimes, she said, the most dangerous weapon is the one you never actually use, but merely leave close enough for someone desperate to consider. Chapter 7. The next morning dawned unnaturally still. Even the village bells, which normally rang faintly across the fields at 7, seemed to hesitate before resuming their chime. Miss Marple, seated by the hearth, watched the steam rise from her teacup with the quiet concentration of someone tracing invisible lines on a map. She wasn't surprised when a knock came at the door just after breakfast. Clara stood there, pale but composed, a folded sheet of paper in her hand. It was under a floorboard, she said without greeting, behind the headboard in the master bedroom. I don't know why I checked. Something just felt off. Miss Marple ushered her in and took the sheet gently. It was handwritten in Sybil's unmistakable script. The date was clear, July the 16th, 1 day before her death. If I am gone, the truth lies with the glass and the hand that offered it. I have taken precautions. If no one believes me, I trust Jane Marple will. The will is hidden where no man would think to look, beneath the skirts of the vicar's widow. Let them dig for riches. I have buried truth beneath pleasantries. Miss Marple's brows lifted slowly. Beneath the skirts of the vicar's widow, she murmured. Clara sat down. What does it mean? It means, Miss Marple said, standing, with purpose, that Lady Sybil hid her revised will somewhere most absurdly conspicuous, somewhere only a certain type of woman would examine without hesitation. She turned toward her bookshelf, ran her finger along the spines, and plucked one out. Saints and Spinsters, The Social History of Vicarage Women. Mrs. Vinton, she said, the previous vicar's widow, a fearsome woman. Past 3 years, a girl, left her costume collection to the parish's amateur dramatic society. The theatre closet in the church hall, Clara asked. Precisely. They arrived at the church hall by mid-morning. The hall was empty, except for a few stacked chairs, and a lingering scent of mothballs and lavender. Miss Marple led the way to the back storage room, unlocked the latch with a hairpin, the key long since forgotten by the parish, and opened the wardrobe. Inside hung a parade of dusty costumes, cassocks, ruffled collars, shawls, and near the end, a faded blue gown with a wide skirt, embroidered modestly if stiffly. Miss Marple's hands moved with surprising agility for her age, patting, pressing, and finally lifting the hem. Her fingers found a flat envelope, carefully stitched into the inner lining. She extracted it silently, opened the flap, and pulled out 3 pages, typed, signed, and witnessed, the revised will. Clara let out a sharp breath. Miss Marple tucked the envelope into her handbag. "We'll give this to Inspector Cray, but not yet." Clara looked startled. "Why not?" "Because it's bait," Miss Marple said softly. "Just like the belladonna." Sybil knew she had enemies circling. She left trails, traps really, but none of them will spring unless someone panics. Clara's voice dropped. "You want them to think the will is still lost." "Precisely. The moment our murderer suspects it's been found, they'll move. Out of fear, out of desperation, and we shall be watching." That afternoon, Marchmont House was quiet. Basil had taken to pacing the corridors like a man waiting for news he couldn't name aloud. He barely looked up when Elspeth Denholm entered the drawing-room. "I thought you'd gone," he muttered. Elspeth ignored him. "She was going to cut you out. You know that." He looked up sharply. "Is that why you've stayed, Elspeth? Hoping for some scraps from the estate?" She didn't blink. She trusted me. She trusted no one. Elspeth turned to leave, but paused. "If I were you, I'd stop trying to erase her. You're not nearly as clever as you think." That night, Miss Marple visited Reverend Fallowby under the pretext of lending him a copy of Morality and the Middle-Class Mind, a book he had neither asked for nor particularly wanted. But she used the opportunity to look once more at the church records, specifically the date Sybil last made a donation. It had been 2 days before her death, a generous sum, with a curious note, "In remembrance, and for the preservation of the truth." Miss Marple returned home and sat quietly in the dark for nearly an hour. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the garden path. She did not light the lamp. She only waited. Just before 10, there was movement at the gate. A figure, hooded, slipped past and into the side entrance of Marchmont House. Not through the front door. Through the garden, Miss Marple stood. Across the village, in a modest rented room above the chemist's, Inspector Cray's phone rang. She said only one thing: "It's time." Within 15 minutes, Cray, Constable Miller, and Miss Marple stood outside the drawing-room of Marchmont House. Inside, Basil Marchmont was standing beside the drinks cabinet, caught red-handed with the port bottle in one hand and a small vial in the other, uncorked. "I can explain," he said immediately. "Of course," Cray replied. But I think we'd rather test what's left in that bottle first." Miss Marple watched Basil's face, not for guilt, but for the flicker of frustration. The kind born from knowing one had been just a step too slow. He had come to repoison the scene. But the bottle he held wasn't the original. It was the decoy, and the real trap had already closed around him. Chapter 8. The following morning, Inspector Cray stood at the edge of the Marchmont garden, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as he watched the forensic team collect the decoy bottle from Basil's study, the bottle Basil had so desperately tried to retrieve the night before, now sat on a velvet cloth inside a padded case, untouched and perfectly sealed. Basil had insisted, almost frantically, that he'd only wanted to secure it, that he'd become suspicious after Clara found that old receipt. Clumsy lies, clumsier timing. Miss Marple arrived quietly through the garden gate, her coat buttoned high against the wind. Cray met her gaze as she approached. "He's not talking now," he said. "Just keeps repeating that he was protecting the family's reputation." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "They often do, when the truth is no longer useful to them." Cray gestured towards the garden wall, and they walked together out of earshot of the house. "The lab's running the tests," said, "but I'll tell you this, we checked the decanter from the night Lady Sybil died. No belladonna, not even a trace, completely clean." Miss Marple didn't seem surprised. "Of course it was." Cray frowned. "Then what was the point?" "The receipt? The trap?" "She never used the belladonna," Miss Marple said gently. "She let it be seen, left the receipt, made inquiries, perhaps even hinted to the wrong person that she was drinking her port again. She laid a trail." Cray nodded slowly. "And Basil followed it." "Exactly. She wanted him to believe it had been used, that her death might be blamed on poison. Even if there were no proof, the fear of discovery would be enough to draw him out and the real cause of death." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Heart failure, I believe, brought on by stress and pressure, possibly accelerated by grief, fear, or her own attempts at self-medication. But not murder, not directly." Cray exhaled. "So all this, Basil's guilt, it wasn't about the act. It was about what he intended. He destroyed the new will," Miss Marple said, "or tried to. He was the only one with access the morning after her death. The solicitor confirmed no draft was ever submitted, but Sybil outwitted him. She kept a copy somewhere he wouldn't think to look, hidden in plain sight. And now that we have it," Cray said, "he panicked. Because to lose the house after her death, to be seen interfering, tampering with evidence, it would look worse than murder." That afternoon, Clara sat in Miss Marple's parlour, the original copy of the revised will folded neatly on her lap. She didn't speak for a long time. "She knew," she finally said. "She knew," she finally said. "She knew she didn't have long. And instead of asking for help, she built this whole performance." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "She'd spent her life orchestrating others. Why would she stop now?" Clara looked down. "She left the house to a historical trust. Not to me, not even a share." "No," Miss Marple said. "She left you the letters, the diaries, and a trust large enough to preserve them." "I suppose that's something," Clara whispered. "A different kind of inheritance." Miss Marple reached over and touched her hand lightly. Sybil knew what she was doing. She didn't want her legacy to be stone and brick. She wanted it to be a story someone could finally tell. And she wanted it protected from someone like Basil. Clara glanced up. What happens to him now? That depends, Miss Marple replied. If the test shows he tampered with the bottle, he'll be charged with obstruction at the very least. And if the forged will is discovered, should he have attempted to submit one, well, then the consequences may be rather more final. A knock at the door interrupted them. Inspector Cray stepped in, his coat damp from the drizzle. We've confirmed the sample he brought last night contained belladonna. Very small dose, but enough to raise eyebrows. And his fingerprints were all over it. Clara's shoulders sagged with relief. And something else. A letting go, and the revised will? Cray asked. In the hands of your office, Miss Marple replied, to be registered immediately. Cray turned to Clara. You've been through quite a lot. Clara gave a tired nod. We all have. Cray lingered a moment, then turned to Miss Marple. I've known clever people before, Miss Marple, but I've never seen anyone catch a man with a bottle he never even used. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One learns a great deal when one listens to what people don't say. Cray tipped his hat and departed. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the fire low, her knitting untouched. Outside, the wind had shifted direction. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a dog barked once, then fell silent. She thought of Sybil Marchmont, not as the cold matriarch the village had whispered about, but as a woman cornered, calculating, who had, in her final days, trusted silence more than speech, and cleverness more than confession. Sybil had not died at anyone's hand, but she had left behind a murder that very nearly happened, and in doing so, she had revealed exactly who was capable of committing it. Chapter 9. Despite the unravelling of Basil Marchmont's scheme, a hush still hung over much Dithering, like a fog that refused to lift. The villagers had begun to talk, of course, first in cautious murmurs, then in confident half-truths. But no one knew the whole of it. Miss Marple, however, suspected there was still one piece missing. Elspeth Denholm had not spoken since the discovery of the will. She'd withdrawn from the house entirely, requesting her bill at the inn and declining all visitors. Clara had tried once, without success. Inspector Cray, twice, and received only silence, and so, on a damp Thursday morning, Miss Marple made her way to the inn herself, her pace deliberate, her cane tapping softly along the cobbled lane. She found Elspeth in the modest parlour, alone, seated by the window with her suitcase at her feet. She did not rise when Miss Marple entered. "I suppose you've come to ask what I didn't tell the inspector," she said without turning. Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "No, my dear. I've come to ask what Sybil told you." Elspeth looked out over the wet village square, her voice low. She knew she was dying. She'd been hiding it. Her heart, she said, it was worsening. She didn't want pity. Miss Marple sat quietly, letting the silence stretch. Then, "Did she ask anything of you?" "She told me to watch Basil, that's all. Just to watch, to stay until it was done. She didn't explain, but I knew what she meant." "And did you?" "Yes. I watched him go through her desk. watched him burn something in the fireplace the morning after. A document. Pale blue stationery. I didn't stop him. I was afraid." Miss Marple nodded, slowly. "But you didn't leave." "No. I stayed because she asked, because I owed her." Elspeth turned then, and her eyes, usually so composed, now showed something raw. "You think she forgave me? For what happened in Tangier?" Miss Marple raised a brow gently. "Tangier?" Elspeth looked away. "It was a long time ago. I loved someone Sybil also loved, but he chose me. She never said a word about it, just stopped writing, until a month ago. There was pain in her voice, not fresh, but long held, like an old wound reopened. She asked you back," Miss Marple said, "and entrusted you with her final game." Elspeth gave a shaky breath. "She never let go of anything. Not pain, not revenge, not love." Miss Marple stood. "And perhaps that's why she finally trusted you. Because you understood." She paused at the doorway. "You are not the last witness, Elspeth. Sybil was." That afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived at Marchmont House with a formal order in hand. Basil Marchmont, now restrained by a solicitor's advice and his own rising desperation, was summoned for questioning in Guildingford. "He won't talk," Cray said, "but the charges are enough now. Will tampering, obstruction, attempted poisoning. It will hold." Clara stood by the library window, arms crossed tightly. "He won't confess to her death." "He doesn't need to," Miss Marple said from the armchair, "because he didn't kill her." Clara turned, startled. "But everything he did—" "He intended to kill," Miss Marple interrupted, softly. "He followed the path she laid out, tried to hide the evidence, tried to control the narrative. But the act itself? No. Her heart failed before he made his move. So he's guilty of trying," Clara whispered. "Guilty of waiting too long," Miss Marple said, "and of assuming she wouldn't outwit him. Sybil died knowing Hercule's conscience would crumble faster than her health." Cray nodded grimly. He walked straight into her posthumous trap. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the vicarage once more, this time not to investigate, but to reflect. Reverend Fallowby served tea with quiet hands and didn't ask questions. They sat together in the study, the old clock ticking between them. "She wasn't a kind woman," he said at last. "But she was honest, brutally so." "She understood people," Miss Marple replied, "and understood what they feared and what they hid. She used that to protect her legacy, not just the estate, but the truth." He nodded. "A strange sort of morality." "All morality is strange when looked at too closely." Miss Marple returned home just after dusk. The fire was low, her knitting untouched. The letter Sybil had written to her, the original, still rested in her drawer. "If no one believes me, I trust Jane Marple will." She had. Not because of the letter, but because she had seen the pattern beneath the actions. The fingerprints of fear, of long-nursed resentment, of calculated delay. Now, with Basil exposed, the revised will filed, and Sybil's final moves understood, the mystery was almost closed, almost. Because somewhere in all the pages and poisons, one question remained. Why did Sybil wait so long? And Miss Marple had the sense, deep and certain, that the answer to that question had less to do with guilt and far more to do with justice. Chapter 10. Rain fell again the next morning, not the showy kind that swept through villages in sheets, but a persistent drizzle that seemed determined to soak into stone, soil, and skin alike. Much dithering moved slower under such weather. The baker opened an hour late. The postmistress delayed sorting her letters. But Miss Marple was up early, standing in the cold grey light of her drawing-room, watching it all. Sybil Marchmont's plan had worked. Neatly, bitterly, and with astonishing foresight, Basil was caught, cornered not by an act of violence, but by his reaction to a trap he believed was real. That had been Sybil's genius. She made him reveal himself without ever needing to accuse him. And yet a shadow remained. The truth felt nearly whole, and yet something in Miss Marple's mind, a quiet dissonance, suggested otherwise. Not a new mystery, but an old one Sybil had chosen never to name. The missing thread, she suspected, lay not in what Sybil had done, but in what she had never explained. She left her cottage after breakfast and walked the narrow lane to the Guildingford Parish Archive, a seldom-used annex beside the county courthouse. The building smelled of damp stone and old ink, and its only clerk, a man named Mr. Purvis, looked surprised to see anyone at all. "I'm hoping to consult your property records," Miss Marple said, "specifically those pertaining to Marchmont House, deeds, transfers, land registry, anything old enough to have dust on it," he obliged, directing her to a back room where ledgers as thick as tombstones lined the walls. For over an hour she searched. Then she found it. Marchmont House, transfer of title, 1919. The signature on the document was not Sybil Marchmont's father, as expected, nor her husband's, but her mother's, alone. Margaret Elspeth Denholm. Marchmont. Miss Marple's fingers paused. Elspeth Denholm. Not a friend from travels, a sister. She shut the book slowly, the storm in her mind now matching the drizzle outside. Back in Much Dithering, Clara was in the drawing-room of Marchmont House, sorting through the few belongings that remained untouched. She found a jewellery box with a broken clasp, a silver thimble, and a folded newspaper clipping. It was brittle with age. The headline, "Family Tragedy in Tangier. Young soldier drowns during diplomatic visit." The name beneath the photo made her blood still. Captain Graham Fielding. She didn't know him, but the article described a British liaison officer stationed in Morocco, dead under mysterious circumstances. No foul play proven, no one charged. The same name Sybil had once muttered in her sleep, weeks before she died. Graham, and at the bottom, two women named in the piece, Miss Sybil Marchmont and Miss Elspeth Denholm. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage to find Clara already waiting. "She lied," Clara said, handing over the clipping. "Elspeth, she said she and Sybil had once competed for a man, but she never mentioned his death, or that she and Sybil were related." Miss Marple took the clipping and nodded. "Sybil didn't want it known. She carried shame like other people carry handbags, close, discreet, and never far from reach." Clara's voice trembled. "You think one of them, Elspeth or Sybil, was involved in this man's death?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Sybil never forgave Elspeth. Not because of Graham Fielding's death, but because of the lie afterward. Whatever happened in Tangier fractured their bond. Sybil may have carried the burden silently, but she never forgot. Then why ask her back? Because in the end, Miss Marple said, Sybil needed her, not as a friend, as a witness, someone who knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively or otherwise, someone who could anchor her story once she was gone. Clara sat down, stunned, and Elspeth did that. She did, not out of loyalty, out of guilt. A knock came at the door. Inspector Cray entered, rain slicking his coat. "I have news," he said without preamble. "Basil's solicitor just handed over a letter. From Sybil, never mailed but addressed to Elspeth, dated a week before her death." He handed it to Miss Marple. The letter was short. "You'll come, won't you? You always said we buried the truth too deep. I think it's time we unearthed it. Not for him, not even for me. For the girl. She deserves the truth, even if it hurts her. We both do." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it. "She wasn't talking about Graham Fielding," she said. "She was talking about Clara." Clara froze. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple turned to her gently. "My dear, your mother died when you were very young. The records were vague, but Sybil never adopted you formally. She simply raised you." Clara's mouth parted slightly. "You're saying Elspeth is your mother?" Clara shook her head. "That's not possible. I would have known. She never—" "She gave you to Sybil," Miss Marple said softly, "out of fear, out of disgrace, possibly after Graham's death, possibly because of it. But Sybil raised you as her own. It was her final, possibly because of it. But Sybil raised you as her own. It was her final claim of control and penance." Cray stepped back, stunned. "So the entire inheritance was Sybil's way of sealing the past, of controlling the story. She cut Elspeth out of the will not from anger, but from closure. Sybil raised Clara. She ensured Elspeth could not reclaim her, even in death." Clara sat silently. She did not cry. She simply whispered, "I think I understand now why she never hugged me." Miss Marple took her hand. "She loved you in her own way, but she was never free of the past, and now at last neither are we." Chapter 11. A soft mist rose across much Dithering the next morning, blurring the line between earth and sky. The village, like the mystery itself, had begun to settle, but uneasily. It was not peace. It was a hush before something final. Marple sat with Inspector Cray once more, this time in the Marchmont drawing-room. Basil was in custody, charged formally with attempted concealment of a will and obstruction of justice, but his silence remained intact. Clara, upstairs in the bedroom she had once believed belonged to a stranger, now sat on the edge of the bed, holding a small music box Sybil had kept in the top drawer of her nightstand. It no longer played, but inside was a single pearl, loose, unstrung, and inexplicably alone. She turned it in her fingers, her thoughts no longer about inheritance or betrayal, but something older. Origin. Downstairs, Cray finished reading aloud the last of Sybil's personal correspondence, retrieved from her bureau drawer, once thought to be empty. "There's a pattern in her tone," Cray said, laying the letter down. "Matter of fact, always clipped. But this last one to the family solicitor, she hesitated. Should anything occur, I entrust Miss Jane Marple to provide the necessary clarity. She gave your name directly. Miss Marple nodded once. Sybil understood the value of truth, but not the comfort of it. She preferred justice in its rawest form, even when it cut. Cray looked toward the window. And Clara? She'll come through, Miss Marple said quietly. She was raised in shadow, yes, but by two women who, despite everything, tried in their own fractured ways to protect her. Cray sat back. We had motive, manipulation, a destroyed will, and a staged poisoning. But the death, still natural. Basil didn't kill her. He reacted to a trap. Miss Marple's hands rested gently in her lap. Yes, and that's why she won. Cray's brow rose. Won? She died on her own terms, Miss Marple replied. She saw the storm coming, and she positioned every piece of her life where it needed to fall. She left no loose ends. Cray thought for a moment. Then this is the end of it? Miss Marple didn't speak at once. Her eyes flicked toward the fireplace, the same one Basil had used to burn what he believed was the only copy of the revised will. No, she said softly. Not quite. Cray turned back. What's left? Miss Marple rose, walked slowly to the mantel, and tapped a finger on the marble. This, the house, the estate, the portrait above the fire. It was Sybil. In oils, stiff, regal, distant, the artist had captured not warmth, but command. Miss Marple continued. Everything was designed to preserve her authority after death. But now Clara knows the truth, and she'll have to decide whether to live under Sybil's name or step out from beneath it. Clara entered the room just then, the pearls still in her hand. She paused at the threshold, then walked toward them with measured grace. I've made a decision, she said, voice firm. The estate will go to the Historical Trust, as she intended. I'll keep the diaries and the personal papers, but not the house. I won't live inside someone else's narrative. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is your right. Clara held out the pearl to her. I think she left it on purpose, unfinished, like the truth between her and Elspeth. Miss Marple took it gently. Sometimes the last stone in a necklace is the one left off, not from loss, but from choice. Cray stood. So, that's it. No hidden murders, no hanging questions. Miss Marple turned toward him. Oh, Inspector, there was murder. It simply never reached the body, only the heart and the years that followed. Cray nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. Miss Marple walked Clara out onto the front lawn, where the sun was beginning to break through the mist. For a moment, the house behind them seemed like something from another age, frozen, watchful, already fading. Do you believe she loved me? Clara asked. Yes, Miss Marple said without pause. In the only way she could, protectively, fiercely, and without softness. And Elspeth? That, Miss Marple said gently, is a question only she can answer. But she stayed, and she watched. That may be a kind of love, too. They stood together, side by side, as the wind picked up through the hedgerows. A single leaf fluttered down and landed on the step. What will you do now, Miss Marple? Clara asked. I'll go back to my knitting, she said, and let the village return to its quiet. It's earned a rest, don't you think? Clara managed a faint smile. Yes, I think we all have. Chapter 12. Much Dithering once again looked peaceful. The air had turned warm with the approach of late summer, and the hedgerows shimmered with green, as though nature had tried to soften the memory of recent events. But peace, as Miss Marple well knew, was not the absence of trouble. It was the echo that followed. Basil Marchmont had been transferred to a holding facility near Guildingford. The charges, destruction of a legal document, attempted fraud, and obstruction, were enough to ensure a formal trial. Though his solicitors pushed for silence, the scandal was already seeping through county lines. The village responded in its usual way. Polite conversations ending in lowered voices, glances exchanged over teacups, and the unspoken understanding that those sorts of things always happen to families like the Marchmonts, never to themselves. But for Clara, silence was no longer an option. She stood before the solicitor's office the next morning, delivering the revised will herself, her shoulders square and her gaze clear. When asked if she wished to contest any part of it, she simply said, "No, the truth stands." By midday, word had spread. Marchmont House would not remain in the family. It would become part of a heritage trust, with tours, catalogued letters, and Sybil's extensive correspondence archived for public study. An exhibition would be arranged. Historians would be invited. The past would no longer be private. That night, Elspeth Denham knocked on Miss Marple's door. She looked worn, tired in a way grief alone could not explain. She held no suitcase this time. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "Not yet." Miss Marple invited her in. The two women sat by the hearth, neither needing to fill the silence right away. "I wasn't a mother," Elspeth said finally. "I gave Clara away. I let Sybil raise her because I thought I couldn't, because I thought love wasn't enough if it came from shame." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, and Sybil thought control would succeed where love failed. Elspeth nodded. "We were both wrong, and now Clara knows." "She does," Miss Marple said, "and she's still standing." Elspeth's hands were folded in her lap, twisting the edge of her scarf. "She didn't say anything to me. When I passed her in the square, she just looked through me." "Not through you," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Past you. She's still deciding whether she wants to look back." Elspeth's voice broke slightly. "And if she never does?" "Then you stay. You make no demands, and one day, perhaps, she'll choose to see you again." Later that week, Miss Marple received a letter, unsigned but unmistakable in tone. "The truth is not easy to live with, but it is easier than a lie. Thank you." See, she folded it once, pressed it between the pages of her gardening journal, and went outside to trim the rosemary bush. Across the lane the vicar stood in his garden, waving politely, with pruning shears in one hand. "Quiet week, Miss Marple," he called. "Oh, yes," she replied. "The kind of quiet one earns." That Sunday the bells rang freely again. At church, Clara entered alone, sitting near the back, eyes steady and unflinching, as the villagers glanced, whispered, then returned to their hymn books. She sang every verse. When it ended, she left without a word. Elspeth stood beneath the yew tree outside waiting, but Clara passed her without slowing. Yet, at the gate, Clara turned. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know," Elspeth answered, and then Clara was gone. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her embroidery. The fire was low, the evening light soft. Everything was still, except her mind, because even now, especially now, she could feel the aftershocks of Sybil's choices rippling across the village. Not loud, not destructive, just present. Consequences were never loud. They settled, like dust, like memory, like truth. And though justice had been served, Sybil Marchmont's greatest legacy wasn't the scandal or the estate, or even her revenge. It was the quiet she left behind, one that forced people to think, to reckon, to rebuild. Chapter 13. A fortnight after the Marchmont scandal had swept quietly through much Dithering, the village exhaled. Conversations turned back to weather and gardening. The post office resumed its ordinary rhythm, and the scandal, though still whispered about, had begun to feel like a chapter nearly closed. But some endings required ink and signature to make them final. Miss Marple stood outside the solicitor's office that morning, her gloves in one hand, the faintest breeze tugging at the edges of her coat. Inside, Clara sat opposite Mr. Hartridge, listening with calm attentiveness as he read from the official letter just delivered from London. The revised will has been certified as authentic, Hartridge confirmed, witnessed legally, uncontested now that Mr. Basil Marchmont has rescinded all counterclaims via his counsel. Clara nodded. So the trust takes possession. Yes, but your role remains as literary custodian, Miss Marchmont. The diaries, letters and family records are yours to manage, under the terms your aunt outlined. Clara hesitated, then spoke quietly. I'll keep them, but they won't be buried again. I'll see to it the story is told. Hartridge raised an eyebrow. A biography. A truth, she corrected. Whatever form that takes. Outside, Miss Marple watched as Clara stepped from the building, head high, expression unreadable. The young woman paused, caught her breath, and then walked straight across the green toward Elspeth. It was not dramatic. No embrace, no tearful reunion. But Clara stopped in front of her, looked into the older woman's eyes, and said quite simply, "Let's talk." And they walked together, past the baker, past the vicarage, past the place where Sybil's portrait still hung in the manor's main hallway, soon to be part of an official tour. Miss Marple turned toward the church. Inside, Reverend Fallowby was sorting hymnals. He looked up and smiled as she entered. "She's found peace, then?" he asked. "Clara," Miss Marple replied. "She's found a place to begin. Peace may take longer." The vicar tilted his head. "And Elspeth?" "She's waited long enough. Now she'll need to wait a little more." Miss Marple left him to his hymns and crossed the road to the stationer's shop. Inside was a single copy of the County Observer, which she picked up and read by the window. A small column buried near the bottom of page 3 caught her attention. Basil Marchmont sentenced to probation and loss of inheritance. Guildingford Magistrates' Court confirmed today that Basil Marchmont, heir to the late Lady Sybil Marchmont, will face no custodial sentence following the court's acknowledgment that his actions, while dishonest, did not directly contribute to the death of the deceased. His inheritance has been fully rescinded. The Marchmont estate has transferred to the county's Historical Preservation Trust, per the terms of the authenticated will. No fuss, No photograph, no drama. Just the final seal on a legacy once so tightly guarded, now surrendered to history. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a small fire, despite the warmth of the afternoon. She took out the last pearl, the one Clara had handed her, and placed it gently in a small ceramic dish beside her chair. It would never be strung. That was the point. Later, as she sat with her embroidery, there came a knock. Inspector Cray stepped in with his usual unhurried confidence, a folded sheet in his hand. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. "Coroner's final statement on Lady Sybil Marchmont." She accepted it silently and read, "Cause of death, natural cardiac failure. No trace of external toxins. No suspicious substances in bloodstream. Belladonna present in property, but not ingested. Death not attributable to foul play." Miss Marple folded the paper and set it aside. "Exactly as it should be," she said. Cray poured himself a cup of tea. "She played a long game." "She played the game," Miss Marple corrected. "She predicted every move, left just enough rope for guilt to pull taut, and still ensured no blood was shed. And yet," Cray said, "she died with enemies." "She also died with a secret," Miss Marple said, "and ensured it lived just long enough to force those left behind to change." Cray sipped his tea. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" "Frequently," she replied, "but I rest between cases." That evening, as the sun sank low over the thatched rooftops of much Dithering, Clara and Elspeth walked once more along the lane. This time Clara held the diary Sybil had kept in her final year. She handed it to Elspeth without a word. They continued walking. Above them, the sky turned violet. Below, the past remained, preserved now in pages, in rooms, in memory, and in the quiet hum of a village that had, for a moment, been reminded how tightly truth clings to the living, even after the dead have let it go. Chapter 14. The transformation of Marchmont House began slowly. Gone were the heavy velvet curtains that had once kept the light out of Sybil's private drawing-room. In their place, linen shears that let in the late summer sun. Dust sheets now covered the furniture until curators arrived, and framed letters, Sybil's handwriting preserved in ink, were being carefully mounted behind glass in the main. Oh, the house was no longer a home. It was history, and Clara, now officially titled curatorial steward by the county's historical trust, spent her mornings in what used to be Sybil's study, sorting, reading, cataloguing. She spoke little to the volunteers. She never raised her voice, but her presence gave the rooms a new gravity. Elspeth came sometimes, quietly, often just to sit nearby. They didn't speak of Tangier, not yet, but sometimes when the light changed or a certain song played from the old gramophone, Clara would look up, and Elspeth would look back. It was a beginning, not of understanding, but of permission. In the village, the scandal faded as all scandals eventually do. It became shorthand, a Marchmont sort of situation, people would say when referring to private disgrace concealed by public manners. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed the rhythms of her life with practised grace. Her roses bloomed late but richly. Her needlepoint returned to its original subject, baby bonnets for the church charity. She visited the bakery every Tuesday and the vicarage every other Thursday. Nothing unusual outwardly, but inwardly she knew she had watched something rare unfold. It was not a murder mystery in the traditional sense. No knife, no pistol, no convenient corpse with an obvious wound. Instead, it was a slow erosion of relationships, of identity, of truth withheld too long. And yet, it had all been solved in its own way. One final letter arrived by post that week, addressed in a familiar hand, from Basil. Miss Marple opened it without surprise. Miss Marple, I assume you believe you've won. Perhaps in your way you have. I will not contest the court's ruling. What's the point? The house is gone, the name disgraced, and Sybil's legacy handed over to strangers in white gloves. You should know I didn't poison her. I wanted to. I planned to, but I didn't. And yet it seems that was enough. You were always going to believe the worst of me, just as she did. Do me the courtesy of remembering that I lost everything without laying a finger on her. Can that be said of the others? Basil Marchmont, Miss Marple, read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it in her filing tin under miscellaneous correspondence, and left it there. Later that afternoon, she walked through the churchyard. The late flowers were in bloom, foxglove, phlox, and the last of the hydrangeas. At the far end of the path, near the newer graves, Sybil Marchmont's headstone stood tall and uncompromising. Clara stood beside it, a soft scarf tucked into the collar of her coat. She was never buried with a verse, she said quietly, as Miss Marple approached. Just her name and the dates. No final words, no legacy. Miss Marple looked at the stone. That was her way, she replied. Control, even in silence. Clara exhaled. I used to think love had to be warm, soft, like in novels, but maybe it's something else, a kind of holding, even when it hurts. Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Love often hides inside duty, and sometimes inside regret. Clara glanced down at the earth. Do you think she was afraid? Yes, Miss Marple said, of being forgotten, and of being remembered for the wrong things. A long pause. Then Clara said, I think I'll publish her diaries, not all of them, but enough. The world should know who she really was. Miss Marple's expression softened. Then she will live again. Not in marble, in meaning. They stood a moment longer in the hush of afternoon. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple finally reached the last stitch in the blanket she had been making since the garden fete. The very same day Sybil had announced her changes. The rows were even, the yarn taut and warm. She folded it neatly and placed it beside the others in a small cedar chest. She poured herself a single cup of tea and sat by the window as the light slipped down behind the rooftops. It had begun with a tea party. It had ended with a legacy rewritten. No blood spilled, no violence shouted, just slow unraveling, and the truth sewn back together, one quiet thread at a time. Because murder, Miss Marple knew, was never only a matter of death. Sometimes it was a silence planned too well, a secret buried too deep, a goodbye whispered without ever being said.